Hello everyone, welcome back. This is our May 2019 meeting, and we're back trying to give you some more information that'll be helpful for you to maintain your health. And today we're talking about fiber, dietary fiber, and the importance of the fiber in foods for your health. Now, I want to make clear, we make dietary supplements. For any of you who may not know who we are, who I am, I'm the person that designs them here, and I work very hard to make very good supplements for you. But we really are talking about foods, even when we're talking about supplements, because legally and actually, dietary supplements are a category of foods. That's how they're categorized in the USA by the Food and Drug Administration, and that's how I see them, as food concentrates. So I really feel like they're both tied very intricately together. Now, fiber is a particularly odd one in a way, because your body doesn't absorb it, doesn't digest it. So fiber is a little bit unusual. Now, it's had a kind of a come and go reputation over the years, and that's where our title comes from, fiber, food, or fetish. And like we said, there's no vitamins in it, there's no minerals in that actual fiber, no phytochemicals, but it's absolutely essential for good health. Now, that has not been understood by a lot of people wasn't understood for a long time. In fact, when I had a health food store back in the 1980s, people kind of made fun of it, doctors in particular, and this is where the title comes from of this talk. They actually said, well, people who are eating bran and things like that, that helps them go to the bathroom better, but it really doesn't do much for you, and that's not that important. And they kind of made fun of the people for having kind of an elimination fetish, which would sort of insinuate some kind of strange obsession with going to the bathroom, maybe some kind of almost sexual type reward from it. So that was kind of insulting. But the people in the natural health food area have been using this since the 1800s. If you remember John Harvey Kellogg, who had the famous Battle Creek Sanitarium, he believed in a high fiber diet, as well as a lot of the other people back in those days. In fact, fiber and bran from wheat, the bran from fiber, the wheat germ, these things were used as kind of the first dietary supplements by the health food industry. Before vitamins were even available, you would find these in health food stores back in the 1920s and 30s. So it has a long history of use, but not a long history of acceptance by the mainstream community. It was just assumed that dietary fiber was something that could be fed to cattle, because as ruminants they could break it down and digest it, but people couldn't. And that's sort of understandable, actually, but not exactly true. However, that's changing. Right now, it's becoming an area of hot research interest. Just published in the Journal of the American Medical Association is the article, High Fiber Diet Might Protect Against a Range of Conditions. And that's important, and this article just came out last week, and that's why I chose this topic today. I want to go through that article a little bit and add some other things to it, and we'll discuss why fiber is so important from the perspective of the Journal of the American Medical Association article. However, before we go a little bit further into fiber, let's just talk about sort of the context in the terms of food. Churches and mills were community centers back in the older days, and not that long ago. Here in North Carolina, you will notice there's a lot of roads named after churches and mills. Just very close to our factory here, we live only a quarter mile from Faneuil's Church Road. About another mile or two down the road is Sutter's Mill Road. So these are common. You see them everywhere. And that highlights the importance they once had in the community. Unfortunately, churches are becoming less important. Mills have almost disappeared. But that's not a great thing, actually. 200 years ago, people would store their grains, their corn that they raised, their wheat, their barley, things like that. And they would take the whole grain down to the mill and have it ground periodically because the flour wouldn't keep well. So they could take a little bit at a time. The whole grain store quite well and it'll last a long time. But once you break that flour, grain seed open and make the flour, it's exposed to air and the oils in there oxidize and become rancid very quickly and actually form very harmful chemicals. So you couldn't store flour. However, with modern food distribution, people were wanting to sell flour in packages so people didn't have to go down to the mill and grind it, periodically. They just go to the store and buy a package of flour. So the solution to that problem was to make flour without the oils and things like that. That meant they made white flour. They removed, and you can see the picture of the grain of wheat there on the slide. The outer part of it is the bran layer, and then there's a germ down there in the bottom, and the biggest part of it is the endosperm, or the white flour part of it. Now, you can kind of read through this thing and see that the bran layer has almost all the fiber, has B vitamins, proteins, iron, and other minerals that are all removed when you make white flour. Go down to the bottom, the germ has lots of vitamin E in it. One of the richest sources actually of vitamin E in the diet. A lot of B vitamins, iron and other minerals, phytochemicals that may help lower the risk of heart disease and cancer, and there's a number of those in there. Those are all missing from, taken out by making white flour. The endosperm does have some protein. It has complex carbohydrates, starch, which are broken down into simple sugars pretty easily. A few B vitamins are left and just a very tiny amount of fiber. So what you see there is it looks like about a fourth of the wheat grain removed, and probably, about 90% of the nutritional value. And here you see a chart that shows 14 major nutrients that are partially or almost totally removed. Vitamin E, almost totally removed. The brown bars, if you look at it, are what's in the whole wheat. The yellow bars shows what's remaining in the white flour. And then we see that you removed about 14 nutrients. Later in the 1940s, they began to require you to add some of the nutrients back, and they called that enriched flour. So you can think about that for a minute. You remove 14 nutrients, put 5 back, and you say it's enriched. You don't want to be enriched in that manner. That's not really enriching. However, there are also a lot of other nutrients in wheat that are removed that aren't even these major vitamins and essential nutrients. And this was done to corn, rice, and other grains as well. So processing became quite common, and it removed a whole lot of nutrition from our foods. And the result was nutritional deficiency diseases. This was most prevalent in Asia. because in Asia, people were very dependent on rice as a source of nutrition. And white rice became the norm in the 1800s. Starting in mid-1800s, they began introducing it, and by the 1870s, I think, it had become pretty common. And nobody could, suddenly there were beriberi cropping up in Asia, and it was a devastating disease that was killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. I could not find how many people died. I don't know if they have adequate records to know that, but it was a very common disease. They were attributing it for a long time to some kind of infectious disease. It really was very difficult for them to figure out what it was. And that's not surprising, because it was a thiamine deficiency that was causing it. But thiamine had never been isolated. They didn't know what thiamine was at the time. So they didn't know how to find out they didn't have the tools to really find it out. They finally figured out there was something in white rice that was bad for you. They thought there was a toxin in the rice, white rice. Something happened to it in milling that produced a toxin. And finally, after that, they decided, well, they can still eat some white rice, but if they give some brown rice, the people seem to be okay. They don't get the beriberi. Eventually, they decided that there was something missing in the white rice, and so they tried adding other foods that had some of it. And kind of oddly, Japanese scientists actually suggested that the Japanese should start eating a Western diet because they weren't getting beriberi, which is kind of ironic now, because in Japan and much of Asia, they are blaming Western diets for most of their modern health diseases. So we can see how these kind of things change over time. However, our main interest today is one that's not still considered a vitamin as such, but dietary fiber. To be a vitamin, you have to have a nutritional deficiency disease. Now, the disease that caused the deficiencies that cause beriberi is why thiamine became considered a vitamin. Vitamin C is because if you don't get vitamin C, you get scurvy. Niacin is considered an essential vitamin because if you don't get niacin, you get pellagra. Vitamin D, its deficiency disease is rickets. So all of these essential nutrients like this have, or almost all of them, have deficiency diseases associated with them. But there's a lot of important nutrients that do not really have diseases per se associated with them. So let's move on to fiber now. Fiber is present in almost all whole plant foods and in almost no animal foods. The one exception perhaps is chitin or chitosan. That is actually a complex carbohydrate that comes from the shells of crustaceans. And it's sort of in the range, in the area of fiber. And it actually can be a prebiotic fiber, one that encourages beneficial gut bacteria. But it's kind of an oddball in the realm of fibers. It's not one that you really think of as a dietary fiber normally. But the plants are just have abundance of a lot of different kinds of fiber, and particularly, you know, the whole plants. When you start processing, you start removing fiber most of the time. So, like we said before, it took a lot of years for fiber to be taken seriously. Kellogg's was one of the first health food companies. In fact, it probably was the first one, and certainly the first one that exists today. And they were making, you know, whole grain cereals and bran cereals and things like that back in the early 1900s, maybe the late 1800s. I'm not quite sure when they started now, but very long time ago, they were making these whole grain foods as health foods to be sold as specialty foods to improve health. When I had a health food store in the 1980s, bran was still a big seller, and it was a popular thing. We had a big bin of it, and people would come and scoop it out into bags and take it to eat it, who wanted to get the dietary fiber. However, even at that time, doctors considered, most doctors considered it to be worthless and not really useful. They believed that since people could not digest it, it was not beneficial. And there was no deficiency disease associated with fiber deficiency, so it was not considered to be a nutritionally essential item. And that's why the Lancet article in 1986, it was May 3rd issue, I think, in 1986, had the article titled Dietary Fiber, Food or Fetish. They were still making fun in 1986 of the dietary fiber. It wasn't long after that till Lancet started publishing articles extolling the benefits of dietary fiber, however, as did a lot of other scientific journals. And now it's very well accepted by everyone to be a very important nutrient. So fortunately, the attitudes have changed, and this diet that you can see in the slide, this article, high fiber diet might protect against a range of conditions. So now we're talking about a lot more than just gut health, actually, with dietary fiber. In fact, I would go so far as to say almost every physiological system in the body, from the brain to the heart, everything benefits in some way from dietary fiber. Low carbohydrate diets such as the Atkins diets and keto diets are popular now for weight loss, but are they healthy? And I'll read some from this journal, the American Medical Association, as they discuss this. And I'll read from this along a little bit today. The popularity of low carbohydrate diets such as Atkins and keto have helped give the macronutrient a bad name. In part, it's deserved. Have carbs got a bad reputation? Certainly, for a very understandable reason, said Jim Mann, a professor in human nutrition and medicine at the University of Otago in New Zealand. They are often highly refined, and in many countries, sugar intake is high. But just as there are bad fats and good fats, there are also bad carbs and good carbs. We show very clearly in our work in diabetes that the benefits of carbs comes from the good carbs, and the good carbs are not high in sugar. Mann said they are high in fiber. So yes, people do lose weight with these diets, Atkins diet and keto diets. But the question is, are they healthy? By definition, those diets are low in fiber and high in protein and fat. However, they cannot provide the benefits of the high fiber diets. And we'll go back again to our article here. It's stating observational data suggested a 15 to 30% decrease in all-cause and cardiovascular related mortality and incidence of coronary heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and colorectal cancer in people who consume the most dietary fiber relative to those who consume the least, the authors found. In addition, clinical trials showed that compared with low intake, high dietary fiber intake lowers body weight, systolic blood pressure, and total cholesterol. Given that the findings from prospective and observational studies and clinical trials were complementary, and that there was evidence of a striking dose response The relationship between a high fiber diet and lower disease risk could be causal, the authors concluded. Although high fiber intake is associated with lower weight, which in turn reduces the risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and many cancers, dietary fiber appears to have benefits independent of its effects on weight, Mann said. These findings and others suggest that virtually anyone who wants to lower their risk of a variety of ailments, including cardiovascular disease and multiple types of cancer such as ovarian, pancreatic, and liver, as well as colorectal, should consume more, not fewer carbs, as long as they're good carbs, i.e., fiber-rich whole grains, legumes, fruits, and vegetables. So, most people in the Western countries, however, consume less fiber than is recommended, and many scientists think that the recommendations are too low. Reading again a little bit here. However, in westernized countries, few people consume anywhere near the recommended amounts of dietary fiber. In the United States, the average dietary intake by adult men and women is 18 and 15 grams, based on the 2013-2014 NHANES study. Yet, the dietary guidelines for Americans recommends a daily minimum intake of 33.6 grams per day, so about twice for men and 28 grams for women, 19 to 30 years of age, and only slightly decreasing as people get older. In short term, if a person has a very high body mass index, almost anything that could cause weight loss would be beneficial, said Edward Giovannucci, a professor of nutrition and epidemiology at Harvard. However, it's not the ideal way of doing it. Now, when we talk of obesity, we know that just about, it is a very devastating problem for a lot of people. However, one thing I would like to point out, you don't have to lose all the weight to start seeing benefits. In a strange twist of fate, when you start losing weight, the metabolic effects are greatly magnified compared to what you would expect. Just the act of losing weight, putting yourself into that metabolic state where you're decreasing weight, has great cardiovascular benefits. It decreases your insulin resistance, and you see real benefits really quickly before you even start seeing very much weight loss. And if you can stay in that kind of zone where you're slowly losing or at least maintaining weight, you're going to be a lot healthier, even if you're still overweight. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, because people do struggle with weight loss. And most people want to get out there and say, wow, I've put on this 30 pounds over the last 30 years and I want to lose it next week. And that doesn't work. But you don't have to do, for the health benefits, you don't have to do that anyway. Well, it turns out that there is very certainly a link between diet and colon cancer. Now, Stephen O'Keefe, a gastroenterologist at the University of Pittsburgh, noticed the higher rates of colon cancer in developed countries. And if you look at the light green areas, those are areas with very little colon cancer or less. Darker green areas, or blue if it's the women below, much higher risk. And when it comes to colorectal cancer, the poor countries actually, the underdeveloped countries did a lot better, the developing countries in the world. The sub-Saharan African countries, certainly very low risk of colon cancer. So he started looking into this and why that would be. And because in Pittsburgh, where he is, at the medical school there, the African American community has a very high risk of colon cancer, particularly. And so he began to look at that and why that would be. And he also had a population from South Africa, population of black Africans who had high risk of colorectal cancer, but who were a genetically similar group. I mean, this community, most of them had come from the same region of South Africa. So that worked out nicely because he was seeing, this was a genetically fairly homogeneous population. So he decided that he could take this group and compare it with the same genetic population in South Africa and see, why there was a difference between the two groups. The same population, essentially, at least genetically, living in Africa or living in the United States. So that's what he did. And to me, I've been going to scientific meetings for quite a few years now. And this study and lecture that he gave, I think it was 3 years ago at the experimental biology meeting in Chicago, one of the sessions of the American Physiological Society, I think was the most memorable talk I've heard in all these years. I really found it fascinating. But what they did, they switched the diets of the African American people, and I think they used all men in this study, living in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, with the African American population in Africa. The Zulu population there. Now, this was an interesting concept, and it's not one that's often done because you don't have these matched populations too often. But they took the diet in that rural area of Africa was mostly corn, and they would hand grind it in a stone mill, beat it, and make a porridge out of it. And that was the main part of their diet. Corn fiber was very high in their diet. And they ate very little meat. It wasn't by choice, really, because they liked meat, but meat's expensive, and they were not a well-to-do population. So they were, of course, thrilled when somebody from the U.S. wanted to come in and give them all these steaks and stuff to eat and big roasts and all that. They were more than happy to comply. They were thrilled, actually. He showed pictures of them just really going to town on that, all the meat that he supplied them. But he tried to keep it balanced, pretty much like you'd have if you were eating here in the United States. And then the not so happy Americans were eating mostly this cornmeal every day for whole grain corn, which was a much less exciting group to be in. But at any rate, the fiber switch was from 14 grams in the U.S. to 55 grams of fiber in the African group, and vice versa. Fats switched from 35% in the U.S. to 16%, and 16% to 35% in Africa. Well, what they were looking at were markers of colon cancer, development colon polyps, certain genetic markers, and they found that these were absolutely switched in the groups. In only 2 weeks, there was a huge difference. And they didn't allow this study to go on very long, because let's face it, you can't go to Africa and give the people colon cancer. That's not ethical. But what does that say about our diets? It's unethical to feed our diets to people in underdeveloped countries. That's a real statement about the diets that we select to eat in this country. And this was published in the journal Nature Communications, and it's a very, very interesting article. So if any of you are so inclined, it is available, open access. Look for, if you just search the terms in like PubMed, go search fiber and O'Keefe, O-K-E-E-F-E, apostrophe K-E-E-F-E, and you'll find a about, I think, 8 or 10 papers that he deals with, but the main one is here, and that's readily available if you're so inclined. I think it's fascinating. If you ever get a chance to listen to him speak, I would highly recommend that as well. It really was fascinating research to see how profoundly increasing fiber can affect a person. Now, corn fiber has a variety of fibers, including ones that can be digested by gut bacteria, not by people, and ones that cannot be. So it's a variety of them and very beneficial. Now, in another one of his articles, he has this table in here showing why the fibers can be helpful. And you can, there again, you can see at the bottom the reference there. That can be looked up. It's also open access in this case. But products of dietary fiber are likely responsible for their benefits, according to him, because they really saw changes in the gut microbiota in the people, both groups, in this study. But there are many benefits of fiber, and the bacterial products made by gut bacteria from that fiber is one of the main things. And if you look at the right-hand side in yellow over there, you see lots of things that dietary fiber can make. The short-chain fatty acids are considered by many people to be one of the most important things that are in there. They can affect the brain, they can affect diabetes and the heart and a lot of different things. But you know, also vitamins are made from these bacteria and a lot of phytochemicals. In fact, a lot of the things that we take as dietary supplements are modified by these beneficial gut bacteria into other things that are even perhaps more beneficial. Example is curcumin. Can be changed into a lot of things. It can be absorbed as curcumin, or it can be absorbed as ferulic acid, for instance, or a number of other things. So these things are very beneficial. On the left-hand side of that table, though, you'll see that the bacteria that process protein and bile acids and fats, for the most part, make things that are harmful. So in a very real sense, a low animal diet and a high plant diet sets you up for a much better metabolic state, as illustrated here. The metabolites produced by plants are almost always beneficial, and only a few of them from the protein foods. There are exceptions to this, just like exceptions to everything. Oddly enough, the omega-3 oils that we find in things like fish, salmon and things, appear to have a beneficial effect on the microbiome. So most oils have a negative effect, but that seems to be an exception. So that's kind of interesting, but maybe one of the mechanisms by which the omega-3 fatty acids do benefit us. Now, some people say that the microbiome is highly resistant to change, and that may not be true, because Dr. O'Keefe saw very profound differences in the microbiomes as people ate their diets or switched their diets. It changed it very profoundly. So diet really can have a major effect. So I believe that both probiotics and prebiotics have their place. I'll state that right off. And we sell probiotics and prebiotics. In fact, we have a new probiotic coming out very soon, in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I hope. I'm not quite sure when all the bugs are getting here, so to speak. But that is coming up soon. But this study in the journal Nature showed that diet rapidly and reproducibly alters the human gut microbiome. The reason why people sometimes think it doesn't change easily is because most people tend to keep their same microbiome throughout their entire life almost, with certain age-related changes. And most people don't experience much change in their microbiome. That doesn't mean it has to be that way, however, because your diet really determines what your microbiome is going to look like, what kind of bacteria are in there, the ones that are good or the ones that are bad. You can give probiotics, but when you stop, it'll tend to go back to where it was for the most part, because the kind of bacteria that are living in your gut are the ones that can live on the foods that you're giving them. And so if you don't change your diet, eventually you're going back where you started with whether you take probiotics or not. Now, you can take probiotics consistently all the time, and that will have a prolonged effect as long as you're still taking it, and will change the microbiota. But if you quit the probiotics, most of the time it'll go back. Now, the exception that I would make to that is people who, for one reason or another, lose bacteria. And people do tend to lose, and as they get older, their bacteria numbers decrease. Or when they take antibiotics, that can totally wipe out an entire species sometimes in the gut. And taking probiotics can put some of those back. If, say, you completely wiped out your bifidobacteria bifidum, well, you can take bifidobacteria bifidum, reconstitute it, and as long as you have the food it needs, it'll stay. But most of the time, if you're not eating the right foods, you're going to lose a lot of those bacteria anyway. So prebiotics and probiotics have their place, but I think the prebiotics are really necessary, the dietary fibers, for your probiotics to really do their job. If you don't feed these bacteria right, they're not going to be able to live in your gut and be happy. So I like to think of probiotics as seeds that we plant, and then the prebiotics is the fertilizer and water that we give them to make them grow, and so they'll stay. Well, I hope you've learned something today. I know that we do have one product, Psyllium, that's a prebiotic, a very nice product, and I would encourage you to get that and use it. We're going to have more prebiotics coming out, and we definitely will have very soon a new probiotic. We already have two, our Colonnade and our L. salivarius. We have brochures that explain their benefits, I think. But at any rate, if we don't, I'll make one soon for the new one at least. But at any rate, these are available to you, and they can really alter your life. When we're looking at diseases such as obesity, diabetes, cancers, the fiber and the prebiotic and probiotics, they can alter the course of all of these diseases and prevent them. So thank you very much for joining us today, and if you have questions, you're welcome to ask. You can always call in and talk to me, and I will try to give you good, honest advice or information. Sometimes I don't know, and I'll be the first to admit that. So if I don't know the answer, I'll tell you that, because there's still a lot of things that we're learning about the human body and nutrition. But thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next month. Goodbye.